Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Earlier today I was messing around with the Retroid Pocket 5. Now this is not a new handheld, it's been around for about 6 months at this point, but every time I pick it up I think to myself, man, they really did a good job putting this thing together. It's got a beautiful OLED 1080p display with enough power to be able to play the vast majority of GameCube and PS2 titles, and it also can dual boot into both Android and Linux. Now, if you've watched any of my recent videos, a lot of this stuff is pretty standard. Like, you will often find OLED displays on these handhelds nowadays, or excellent controls, or the ability to play things like GameCube and PS2, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, when I first got into this hobby about 5 years ago, something like the Retroid Pocket 5 would have been mind-boggling at this price point. And so in today's video, I want to take a step back and talk about, some of the handhelds that we had back in 2020 and how they have evolved to what we have today and how much better they are now. And I think it's definitely something worth celebrating. This transition from something like the Retroid Pocket 2 in 2020 to the Retroid Pocket 5 in 2024 and now 2025 is really kind of revolutionary. Let's start with the first real handheld that I ever owned, which is this one here, the Anbernic RG350. Now, I picked this one up in the middle of the pandemic. It probably was around middle of the year 2020. I was working from home at the time. I was bored to tears. I had played through a bunch of PS4 games and I wanted to play something else. And at first I was emulating on my computer, but then I heard about these handhelds. I watched a couple of YouTube videos, ordered one of these, and away I went. And so the Anbernic RG350 really kind of started everything for me, but it did not look like this back in the day. For example, I've got these 3D printed grip nubs right here instead of sticks. This was to make the device more sleek and a little bit easier to use. I also added a new screen. So the original one was 320 by 240 in resolution and was also not OCA laminated, which means that there was a gap between the glass and the screen itself, which made the viewing angles really bad. And so unfortunately I don't have an original one to show you just how bad it was back in the day, but hopefully you get an idea of what it was. And honestly, at the time, this little handheld was kind of revolutionary on its own. This was actually a clone of a different handheld, this one right here, the GCW0. This guy was an open source handheld that came out before my time. This was actually sent over to me by a viewer, and this thing is like the OG, but it had a couple flaws to it. Number one, it only had a single analog stick, and it really wasn't a stick, it was just kind of a slider, and it also had old school USB charging instead of USB-C. However, the chip and the firmware and everything else is the exact same on this as the RG350. So this one is kind of a clone that's been upgraded with dual sticks as well as USB-C charging. Now the operating system on this is Linux based. It's called OpenDingX. And the way it used to work back in the day is that you would go through, you would pick your emulator, and then once you go through your emulator, you would have to then navigate through all the different games and then choose your game from here. And the processor on this handheld is not great. It can play most PS1 games and all but a few Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance games, but even those systems hit their limit. And at the time I bought it, I think it was around $80 for the RG350 and then another $40 shipping. Shipping was crazy back in 2020 and this one was no exception. Now when I first got this handheld, I thought it was pretty cool, but it took a lot of work to get set up, finding the right emulators, the most recent updates and whatnot. And that's one of the reasons why I started my website and YouTube channel in the first place, was to help others and kind of figuring out tutorials and how to get the most out of this handheld. Now things did get better for the RG350 over time, and a lot of it had to do with both hardware updates from Anbernic, so they went on and made a metal version as well as a new plastic version called the RG350P, but then also community software really stepped up with this as well. Instead of having just a bunch of random emulator apps, we ended up getting RetroArch on this handheld as well, so we were able to start using some of those standard cores on this handheld. Later on, we got a software package called Atom, and so this allowed us to essentially navigate through our system like a front end, and then we could pick our system, pick our games from here, even with box art. So this was a kind of a big deal back then as well. Bear in mind that the performance was still very limited on this handheld. We could play up to most Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, and PS1 games, but we still were hitting some of those limitations. But for me, this was my entry point into the emulation handheld world, and it all started with the Anbernic RG350, and then some of its counterparts that came out after that. But I learned a lot from this handheld, how to use a Linux operating system, how to write like new themes and stuff to make it look prettier. All those things were part of just making this handheld actually work. Now later that year, Anbernic came out with its next generation Linux handheld. It was this one called the RG351P. Now this one was also a clone of another device called the Odroid Go Advance, but it was quite a bit more powerful and had a lot more features. Number one, it was based on emulation stations, so we were able to navigate through the menus and use box art and videos, things like that. So very similar to what you find today. In fact, the processor in this is the RK3326, which is still used in cheaper handhelds today. Now, this one was a lot more expensive back then. I think I paid about $110 plus shipping for this one. But again, this handheld taught me a lot about just, using an emulation station front end, how to use RetroArch. All those things came from the Anbernic RG351P. And also because we had extra power, I was able to play some systems that I couldn't before. So in addition to things like PS1, you could play a good amount of like PSP, Nintendo 64, Saturn, and Dreamcast. Now, this device had its own share of problems. One of them was the fact that it was supposed to come with Wi-Fi, but they ended up yanking it out right before release. Essentially what happened was the way they had put their Wi-Fi antenna in the device, it made the speakers crackle, and it was really distracting. And so initial customers did get Wi-Fi in theirs, including me, but after that, they shipped it without the Wi-Fi, and they added that later on with other devices. The screen on this also was pretty good at the time, but in hindsight, it wasn't that great. It had a resolution of 480 by 320 and a 3:2 aspect ratio. Now, that is a perfect 2x integer scale of Game Boy Advance, so that looked awesome, but everything else was just a little bit weird. This means that we had pretty big black bars on the left and right when playing 4:3 content, and that lower resolution also didn't scale very well with many of those systems, and so everything looked a little bit bad. But again, at the time, in 2020, this thing was awesome. I made so many videos about this, trying to just squeeze as many cool things out of it as I could, trying to get like special ports to work on it or new systems that I'd never tried before. And so I really enjoyed that time on this channel as well. Now, around that same time, we had another big handheld come on the scene. It was the Retroid Pocket 2. Now, I was not around for the Retroid Pocket 1, which was a vertical handheld, but I was there for the launch of the second one. Now, the big thing about the Retroid Pocket 2 is that it came with Android. And at the time, Android devices usually had a little bit better performance than Linux handhelds. And that really came into play when it came to Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP. And from a hardware perspective, at the time, this thing was pretty crazy too. It actually had stacked shoulder buttons, which was not something that you commonly saw. It also had micro HDMI out that worked. I think it only outputted to like a 480p resolution, but still, many handhelds at the time would have HDMI ports that wouldn't actually work, or they just wouldn't have video out at all. Another really cool thing about this one is that we had multiple color options. So I had this one, which I called yellow, but they called orange, but there was also a pink and a light blue version as well. And so it was really cool at the time to be able to pick a color that you thought was the best. And I remember at the time that people were freaking out on Discord and Reddit and stuff about how some colors were shipping faster than the others. And so people were like changing their orders so they could get like a blue one because that one would ship like 3 days faster. It was a very crazy time back in 2020 when it came to getting your hands on one of these handhelds. And I remember at the time just being completely intimidated by this thing because honestly, this was the first Android device I had ever used in my life. I had used, iPhones up until then, and so I was not familiar with the operating system. Now, in fairness, this is a different OS than what it shipped with. This is actually using Lineage OS, so it ran a little bit zippier. But at the time, yes, it came with just standard Android, and it was really hard to navigate. Number one, this does not have a touch screen, and so you have to navigate everything through the controls themselves or plugging in a USB mouse. The controls on this device were not the best either. We had like a Nintendo Switch style Joy-Con, but this thing did not click down for L3, and then the D-pad itself had really hard to push down dome switch connection. And same thing with these face buttons. These were dome switches and kind of hard to push down on, and you can also see that they barely stuck out from the case. So this was not a very fun device to play on over long periods of time because it was very fatiguing. Also on the right side, we didn't have an analog stick, but an analog slider. Now, this was kind of cool in some ways. For example, it didn't get in your way when you were trying to use the face buttons, but in practice, it was actually pretty terrible to use. Either way, at the time, the Retroid Pocket 2 was a pretty cool handheld. It was pretty cheap as well. I think it was like $80 or $90 before shipping and taxes. And, for me in Hawaii, it cost a lot more. It was like $120 to get it shipped to me. But still, it was really cool to see a little bit of competition heating up between like Anbernic and Retroid and getting the best handheld that you could around $100 $100 to $150. And when you compare like the Retroid Pocket 2 against the Retroid Pocket 5, it is really cool to see how this evolution worked over time. For example, after the Retroid Pocket 2 and 2 Plus, they swapped out the analog stick and D-pad locations, so it became a D-pad-centric device, which was great for retro games. We also went through a bunch of evolutions when it came to the D-pad. They eventually settled on something that was like a PS Vita-style D-pad, and then also the face buttons have changed a lot over the years as well. These are now rubber membrane. We've also seen a bunch of changes when it comes to the screens, which are now, touch screen, and then also, AMOLED and widescreen. We've got a bunch of different options depending on the device that you get. But even without going into my closet and bringing out every single Retroid iteration, you can see the jump from the Retroid Pocket 2 to the Retroid Pocket 5. In just 5 years, we've had a pretty big change. Nowadays, we've got Hall effect sticks with RGB custom lighting and, analog triggers and active cooling. There's just so many cool features that we have with these devices, and they just get a little bit better over time until you start to look back and see that, man, that was a big jump. And another cool aspect is that we have the same device in multiple form factors. So the Retroid Pocket 5, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, and the Retroid Pocket Mini with its version 2 screen all have the exact same chipset and power. And so I love the fact that we have other form factors to choose from depending on what you're actually looking for. Also, one quick note, the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2, which has the original screen or the Retroid Pocket Classic screen on it, is now actually being sold by Retroid, I think in limited quantities. But I will leave that one linked down below if you want to get this smaller handheld with this bigger screen. Either way, this is what really impressed me about the Retroid Pocket 5 earlier today when I was messing around with it, was that we have just jumped so far when it comes to the original Retroid Pocket 2 in 2020 to these three options that we have in 2025. Now, the evolution of Anbernic handhelds from, the original RG350 and the RG351P has also come a long way in the past 5 years, but in different directions. One of the main examples are all of the H700 devices. These all have an XX in their name. They all use the same chipset, and they mostly can use the same software options, but we've got a bunch of different choices when it comes to form factor, screen size, things like that. So this, to me, is one of the neater things that Anbernic has done, is that they've figured out like all the different form factors they'd like to support, and then offered a bunch of handhelds that can kind of match different needs for different people. And the great thing about this is that, the custom firmware developers, who are basically just people doing this as a hobby, who really are the backbone of this community, they can basically just switch over from one device to the next with the same firmware because they're using the same chipset. So it's really just a matter of, changing out some parameters for the screen and whatnot. But that's why we have so many of these supported by so many different firmwares. And another great thing is that all these handhelds are relatively cheap. You can usually find them around the $60 to $70 price point, and often cheaper depending on the sale. Now, on the other side, Anbernic has also been pushing towards the high end as well. So we've got two different devices that are great examples. The first is the RG406H. So this one is Android based and is about $150 and can play most PS2 and GameCube games. And then we have the RG557, which is even more powerful, and this one costs about $250. And so these are devices that can also somewhat compete with the Retroid Pocket 5 line of devices as well. We've also seen a lot of improvements from Anbernic over the years as well, not just in processing power, but in their hardware. So for example, with the 406H, this one has a 720p 4:3 aspect ratio display. It is wonderful for retro game content. And they've also been doing some improvements with things like their D-pad and analog sticks and face buttons over the years as well. Now, they change these up with all their devices, and so sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not, but I love the fact that they keep trying new things as well. And so again, for me, it's really exciting to see this evolution from the RG350, which struggled to play all PS1 games, up to something like the 406H, which is a pretty great GameCube machine, all things considered. And the amount of growth that we've seen over the past 5 years really makes me excited to see what things are going to look like 5 years from today. Now, one other example to show just how far we've come over the past 5 years is talking about like these little throwaway vertical handhelds. These have always been around, and we've seen some big changes over the years for these as well. A great example of how it used to be is this guy. This is called the BitBoy, and this is also a little bit before my time, but this essentially was a really cheap vertical handheld that had a very similar menu system to what we were talking about earlier with the Anbernic RG350. So you would go through here, you would pick your system, then choose your game, and then launch it from here. here. And the performance on this one was pretty bad as well. It had a hard time playing things like Super Nintendo and some of those other systems as well. So this thing was definitely a cheaper handheld, but it was kind of neat that you had something so pocketable that could play old school games. And fun fact here is that BitBoy is essentially the same people that made the Miu line of devices. So the Miu Mini and the Miu Flip and all that. And so it is also cool to see the evolution of these devices as well. You know, from the old BitBoy to the Miu Mini Plus, you know, that has Wi-Fi and the ability to play up to PS1 no problem. We've also got other devices like the TrimUI Brick, which has a really high resolution display, a bunch of custom software options, and is still very pocketable and easy to use. And so I love the fact that we have all these vertical handheld options today that are still very pocketable and still quite cheap. You can usually find these for around $50. Another recent favorite of mine is the Retroid Pocket Classic. This one is a little bit bigger, but has that really beautiful screen that we were just showing with the Retroid Pocket Mini. And so this one has been one of my favorites too, and it really doesn't break the bank. It's about $130. And so this is also another really cool thing that we've seen over the past 5 years is that these Game Boy style handhelds keep getting better and better, including like this Retroid Pocket Classic, which can play like GameCube and PS2 games, which is just crazy for $130. And the final category that I wanted to talk about that has really kind of opened up over the past few years has been high-end premium emulation devices like this one here, which is the AYN Odin 2 Portal. We've got a bunch of different Odin 2 devices, but they all have the same chipset, which is super powerful. It has the ability to play things all the way up to Nintendo Switch, which is kind of crazy. And something like the Odin 2 Portal is also an amazing streaming handheld. It has a 7-inch 1080p OLED 120Hz display, which makes it amazing when it comes to game streaming. Now, of course, these devices are a lot more expensive. They're around like $300+ all the way up to like $500, but it's still really cool that we have this premium tier of handhelds as well that definitely did not exist back in 2020. And then also we have handheld PCs, which have been around since before 2020, but really didn't get popular until the Steam Deck came out in 2022. And it's crazy that this handheld is still so good at 2025 for its price point, which is still very, very competitive. In fact, we haven't really seen a handheld PC that can compete with the Steam Deck in terms of price. And so yeah, this is what led me to decide to make a video just kind of yapping about handhelds today, is that, you know, they are so good today. And I often find myself nitpicking little things, you know, like how a button feels or how the sticks feel and whatnot, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are in such a good place when it comes to handheld gaming today compared to 2020. The sheer amount of changes and improvements we've seen from the Retroid Pocket 2 over to something like the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is really impressive, and it's kind of easy to lose sight of the fact that we have come a long way. I mean, we've got a clamshell right now that has an OLED display that can play PS2 games, and you can throw it in your pocket. I think that's just amazing. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you been around these whole 5 years, and what do you think of this whole evolution? Or are you just jumping in now, didn't realize that things used to be pretty bad back in the day, but they keep getting better and better? I can't wait to see what this thing is going to look like 5 years from now. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.